Prime Minister Mark Carney is continuing his globe-trotting search for trade and investment today. Right now, Mark Carney is headed to London, where he's expected to meet with the leaders of the United Kingdom, Spain, and Denmark. And this morning in Ottawa, the Prime Minister hosted his counterpart from Ireland.
This is one of our strongest relationships, culturally, economically, with respect to shared values in foreign policy.
The Irish Prime Minister said that Ireland will soon ratify Sitta, Canada's trade deal with the European Union. And after that, Ireland will send a high-level trade delegation to Canada. So what future does Ireland see for trade with Canada? Joining me now is the Prime Minister of Ireland, Taoiseach Micheál Martin. Taoiseach, it's good to meet you. Thank you for coming in, sir.
Thank you very much indeed, David.
You're here primarily to promote Canada-Ireland trade. The European Union is in a situation where it's agreed to 15% U.S. tariffs, like a lot of us dealing with that, including a lot on the tens of billions in pharmaceuticals from Ireland. How much urgency has this disruption by the U.S. created to boost trade with Canada?
I think a significant urgency, although it has to be said that we had European Union and Canada had agreed a trade agreement back in 2016, 2017, CETA agreement as it's known. Has been a phenomenal success in respect of Ireland and Canada. Our trade has doubled since then. We're going to ratify that formally in our Parliament this year, but it's in operation for quite a number of years. But I think more importantly, the US decision to increase tariffs has kind of underpinned the necessity for Europe to be more self-sufficient and self-reliant, but also to pivot more towards trade deals and towards alignment with like-minded countries. And Canada is an obvious choice, and I think it's a two-way relationship, and I think it's going to get stronger. And I discussed that with Prime Minister Carney when I met him.
Right.
We had good discussions. I mean, the economic relationship between Canada and Ireland is very robust, very significant and large. But also, Ireland being a long-time member of the European Union, we have the presidency in the latter half of 2026. That will be a friend in court to Canada in terms of growing that relationship between Canada and the European Union.
Right. Well, look, a common law country, similar language is a good base of operations to have access to the European market for Canadian businesses that wanted to go there. But the
report says that Ireland is an ideal location for Canadian businesses.
Right. This is the Conference Board of Canada report.
Yeah, the Conference Board to penetrate the European Union market.
But coming the other way, I mean, part of the appeal to Canada is access to the North American market, and I'm sure you're aware that is being very much disrupted. So what does that disruption do to the appeal of Irish foreign direct investment in Canada if the very future relationship with the United States is topsy-turvy?
Well, I mean, notwithstanding the tariffs in the US, we will navigate those and we will still have a very strong economic relationship with North America. But the relationship with Canada stands on its own. It's quite substantial in its own right in terms of exports into Canada and Canadian exports into Ireland. So it's a multi-billion euro trade relationship. And also Ireland and Canada both undertaking very significant capital infrastructure developments. I said to the Prime Minister that Canadian companies were anxious that they would look at the Irish market in terms of contributing to the Irish infrastructural development, particularly in public transport. We're building a new metro in Dublin. We need international consortia to tender for such large-scale projects, people who have expertise in that domain. And that's something, likewise, Irish companies can benefit from the infrastructural investment in Canada. So it very much stands in its own right. And there's a sufficient...
Does it make it less enticing?
No, it doesn't. No. I mean, there's a sufficient critical mass within the Canadian economy to be very attractive to Irish companies and Irish businesses.
They're trying to clean up a lot of the interprovincial trade barriers here and reduce some of the regulatory burden that Canadian companies have complained about, but will be even more difficult for a foreign company to come in and navigate. In your conversations with the Prime Minister, did you touch on that? Because it seems that this is one of the barriers for Irish investment.
He did touch on the need for Canada, to streamline its approaches, and likewise we have to do the same. I mean, what's interesting is we all have common challenges in the modern era, regulatory challenges, planning challenges, and all Prime Ministers are really working hard to try and streamline, simplify regulation, and accelerate infrastructural projects. So that is an issue that has been identified by Irish business and companies as a potential barrier to trade. But that said, remember, trade has doubled in the last 7 or 8 years because of the trade agreement. So I think there's huge potential, and all of the research is showing that we can grow by $1.5 billion a year the trade relationship between Canada and Ireland, and I think that's very exciting news, and it's something we're going to pursue very strongly.
Prior to Ottawa, you were in New York, as I
Yes.
understand it, for the United Nations meeting, where Canada and other countries have caught up with where Ireland has been on the issue, the question of recognizing a Palestinian state. What material progress do you think this will actually have, given the U.S.'s position on what's happening there and the conduct of the Israeli government in this moment?
Well, I would hope that the very significant and growing international consensus around the need to end the slaughter in Gaza, slaughter of civilians and innocent children, the need to release all hostages, and the need for a massive surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza would cause Israel to reflect and to stop this war. The vast majority of the world can't all be wrong in terms of the necessity to stop this war. I do believe that there are efforts underway to try and broker a ceasefire, and I believe the US is interested in a ceasefire, and the release of all hostages, obviously, to come with that. And also then there have been proposals, the French Saudi Arabian initiative and the very significant session that was held at the UN, where quite a number of countries, 10 or 12 more countries, recognised the state of Palestine. And it's a logical conclusion. If we've all agreed on a two-state solution. For a two-state solution, there has to be two states. The state of Israel, which needs security guarantees, that's fully accepted, but also a state of Palestine. And ultimately, we experienced conflict in Ireland for 25 years. We achieved a peace resolution. There was good political will behind that. It's hard work. One has to continue to work on reconciliation, which we're doing to this very day. We just signed, or not signed, we agreed a framework with Britain in terms of legacy in Northern Ireland, dealing with the loss of life of loved ones and so on, and trying to give closure and proper investigative powers to that new framework. And so we have some experience of conflict. It can be resolved. In the darkest days of Northern Ireland, we Canadians helped us, General John de Chastelain, who we honour today in terms of a scholarship programme that we're now developing in his honour. I mean, he played a pivotal role in decommissioning and in the Irish peace process. So the internationalisation of the Irish issue did lead to its resolution. US played a huge role. And so
but there were willing partners in that conversation.
That's the key.
And there isn't right now, right? I mean, the Netanyahu government has flatly rejected it, and some key members of his coalition have talked about annexation, and Mike Pompeo, the US ambassador to Israel, has rejected it. So very key players in this one.
I think one finds it very difficult to understand the ultimate strategic goal of Israel in all of this. Particularly, I mean, it has marginalised moderate Palestinian leadership for far too long. So I think that is a challenge. I think Hamas have been a huge challenge, let's be honest. They've been a very destructive force in Gaza. They took over in a very violent and terrorist way as well, and they took out a lot of Fatah at the time when they assumed supremacy and power in Gaza. So, but that said, I think there's a sufficient support from the Arab states to come behind the peace initiative, and the international community are now clear that they will also come behind a peace initiative in Gaza, because the alternative is too horrible to contemplate, and also the potential destabilization of the region. Countries like Jordan and Egypt have been very, in my view, fair contributors here and endeavouring to try and create stability and peace. But the behaviour of the Israeli government, in my view, is almost oblivious to the impacts on these countries and on neighbours with whom it has signed peace agreements in the past and have a good relationships prior to all of this. And I think there's a lot to be lost here if sense doesn't prevail.
Ireland's called it a genocide.
Yes.
And the international courts will deal with that, and Canada is waiting on that adjudication. But if international opinion has shifted so strongly, as we saw at the General Assembly, but Israel persists and the U.S. continues to back them, I mean, how optimistic are you that this can happen, a peace of any kind can happen in a reasonable time frame?
Well, it is very bleak at the moment. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's very, very bleak. I think humankind is shocked. I think the people on the streets of most countries are absolutely horrified at the images that are coming from Gaza. I've often said, you know, one of the first things the international community should now seek is access to Gaza for international media,
Right.
and for governments to be able to go in and witness what's happening in Gaza. Because I think and all wars end, and when it ends, I think people will be even more horrified at the carnage that has taken place. I mean, and you know, we legally intervened in the South African case because we believe humanitarian aid. It's been a consistent position of Ireland when we were on the UN Security Council. We maintained humanitarian corridors to Syria, to Tigray in Ethiopia in the height of the Ethiopian war. Our position in Israel is consistent with all of that. In Palestine is consistent with all of that. Israel takes umbrage at our position, but we look at everything through the lens of humanitarian law, and what's the right thing to do. And the killing of innocent children, the denial of education for over 2 years, hunger, starvation, famine. I mean, many people just cannot comprehend that this is happening in this era, and it needs to stop.
I know you have to go, but I want to squeeze
Fine.
in one last question if I can, and it's about Ukraine. And you've provided non-lethal support to Ukraine in its fight with Russia to help with the demining efforts and provided them with ambulances and vehicles. I know the official position of Ireland is neutrality, but with the U.S. sort of pulling out of that theater, though the President has said some things this week that makes you wonder what is next from the United States, is a position of providing only non-lethal aid, is that tenable and sustainable given the nature of that conflict and its duration?
But first of all, it is in the sense that we're not a military power. We don't have significant military hardware, if I'm honest. We have contributed to the European Peace Facility, although Hungary's position has paralysed the deployment of that, but we use bilateral channels to send funds to the Ukraine. And I think we can make a very effective contribution. I think one of the most effective developments has been the Coalition of the Willing, which we are members of, and we're willing to be peacekeepers and play a role in peace monitoring in any ceasefire that would occur in Ukraine. But the Coalition of the Willing, which was initially led by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, has gathered significant support. Mark Carney has been a very effective partner there as well, Australia and New Zealand and others. And I think that has worked with President Trump and the US to bring them within that orbit. There's been very significant and effective discussions, which has meant that Ukraine has not been marginalised and has not been cast adrift. And I think that's sending a very strong signal to President Putin that Europe and its partners and Canada and everybody are in this for the long haul. Why? Because we're defending and protecting a fundamental principle, that is the UN Charter, which guarantees the territorial integrity and sovereignty of every state. Ireland is a small state. Multilateralism is our guarantor. We're not a military power. We will have to increase spending on defence, subsea cables, cybersecurity, all of that. But we're still and never will be a significant military player, although we have certain expertise in peacekeeping. We've been doing that for decades now. And I think we can make a contribution in certain areas with defined tasks and so on that could add value.
Taoiseach Micheál Martin, I know you have to go. Thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate
Thank you very much indeed. You're very welcome.